Tehran, 1977. Yaakov, a senior Israeli Defense Ministry liaison, sits in the opulent lobby of the Royal Tehran Hilton. The air smells of rich black tea and expensive cologne, contrasting the cold mountain wind outside. His fingers trace the stiff, heavy paper of highly classified blueprints. He is here to build a ballistic missile for the Shah of Iran. Modern news feeds you a pervasive myth. They say Israel and Iran are eternal religious adversaries locked in an ancient holy war. The reality is far more complex. For nearly 30 years, these two nations were the closest of allies. They were bound in a shadow marriage of crude oil, espionage, and advanced weaponry worth billions of dollars. The stakes were absolute. Encircled by hostile Arab states and Soviet steel, Israel desperately needed energy and strategic depth. Iran was a non-Arab powerhouse craving the technology to dominate the Persian Gulf. They were united by the cold calculus of mutual survival. To stay alive, they had to arm each other. As Yaakov finalizes the paperwork for a devastating new weapon system, the foundation for a future conflict is quietly laid. How did the heirs of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who liberated the Jewish people from Babylon in 539 BCE, transform from Israel's greatest patron into its deadliest nemesis? The answer lies in the dirt, the oil, and the blueprints on Yaakov's table. To understand this clandestine empire, you must look to the blistering heat of the Negev desert. Buried beneath the baking red dust lies Yaakov's logistical masterpiece. It is a 254-kilometer, 42-inch steel artery known as the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. Built after the 1967 war, it pumped millions of tons of Iranian crude oil directly to the Mediterranean. It smelled of sulfur, sweat, and survival. The maritime deception was brilliantly simple. Colossal Iranian supertankers gorged themselves on heavy crude in the Persian Gulf. Their captains officially logged their destination as Gibraltar. It was a complete fabrication. Instead, they sailed straight into the Israeli port of Eilat under the cover of darkness. In exchange for this continuous flow of energy, Israel paid in advanced steel and tactical expertise. Yaakov oversaw the quiet, relentless delivery of weaponry into Tehran. Under a shadowy intelligence pact codenamed Trident, hardened Mossad operatives trained the Shah's feared secret police. They taught them the intense mechanics of counter-espionage, advanced interrogation, and strict population control. Israeli military engineers walked the bustling, exhaust-choked streets of Tehran like royalty. They drank sharp liquor at lavish diplomatic receptions, insulated from the poverty in the alleys outside. Yet beneath the velvet curtains of the royal palaces, a dangerous pragmatism reigned. Israel was transferring immense technological power to a highly volatile autocracy. Would the massive military apparatus they were building eventually turn its sights on them? The peak of this shadow alliance materialized in April 1977 under a quiet code name. They called it Project Flower. The Shah wanted a short-range ballistic missile, and he wanted Israel to help build it. Yaakov stared at the heavy, blue-inked schematics. They detailed a weapon capable of delivering a massive 750-kilogram warhead. The logistics were staggering. Iran handed over a $280 million down payment, paid entirely in thick, unrefined crude oil. In return, Israeli engineers traveled to a heavily guarded assembly facility. It rose from the baking dust near Sirjan, deep in central Iran. But what happens when two survivalists try to outwit each other? Beneath the diplomatic handshakes, a cynical game of mutual exploitation was in motion. Yaakov was playing with fire. Israeli leadership feared giving their best technology to a regime that might suddenly fracture. So, they rigged the deck. They planned to hand over older, modified variants of the weapon. Israel was secretly using Iranian oil wealth to finance its own future defense systems. It was a high-stakes gamble built on pure deception. Yaakov and his team were arming a volatile autocracy with ballistic capabilities that could eventually target Tel Aviv. As the heavy steel doors of the Sir John facility swung shut, the ground beneath the Shah began to crack. The tension in Tehran was no longer about payload trajectories. It was about surviving the coming storm. The storm finally broke in February 1979. Freezing winds carried the sharp sting of tear gas through the streets of Tehran. The monarchy collapsed, taking the pragmatic alliance down with it. For Yaakov and his network of military engineers, the mission instantly shifted from geopolitics to pure escape. Millions marched outside their windows, shouting against the very architects who built their defense grids. How do you hide a massive ballistic missile program during a revolution? You do not. Yaakov frantically navigated ransacked offices, stuffing highly classified Project Flower blueprints into secure diplomatic pouches. They fled the country on secret evacuation flights in the dead of night. Behind them, they abandoned millions of dollars in heavy steel and half-built launch facilities in the baking desert. Days after the monarchy fell, the unofficial Israeli diplomatic mission was overrun by armed militants. The building that served as the nerve center of Yaakov's operations was stripped bare. The Israeli flag was torn from its mast and thrown into the dirt. Soon after, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat flew into the chaos, arriving as the first foreign dignitary to endorse the new regime. Arafat stood triumphantly on the balcony of the exact building where Israelis had quietly brokered weapons deals. He raised the Palestinian flag over the capital. In mere hours, a 30-year alliance of oil and espionage was replaced by a rigid theology of anti-Zionism. The engineers escaped with their lives. But what about the heavy steel beast they left behind in the dark? The frantic evacuation flights saved Yaakov and his engineering teams, but the technological seeds they planted refused to die. Today, the massive Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline sits baking in the Negev desert. It is a ghost of heavy steel. The infrastructure remains entangled in endless, secretive arbitration in Swiss courts, with Iran demanding over $1 billion for its confiscated crude oil. The financial disputes pale in comparison to the military reality. The concrete bunkers and advanced intelligence frameworks negotiated by Yaakov laid the groundwork for a new era. Instead of crumbling, those abandoned facilities in the central deserts nurtured an indigenous missile program. The original blueprints of Project Flower were shredded in a panic, but the deadly mathematics survived. A 30-year bond of mutual survival was violently shattered, replaced by a devastating proxy war stretching from the rubble of Lebanon to the waters of the Persian Gulf. How do you measure the true cost of survival? You look at the weapons left behind. The absolute tragedy of this clandestine marriage is that they heavily armed each other before the doors locked. The very weapons born from that pragmatic alliance of crude oil and espionage are currently aimed across the dry expanse of the Middle East. They stand upright in reinforced silos, calculating trajectories toward the exact cities that designed them. The heavy steel beasts built by Yaakov are simply waiting in the dark.